The story of Exodus stands as one of the most powerful narratives of faith, resilience, and divine intervention in all of history. It begins with the Israelites in bondage in Egypt, where they face harsh treatment under the rule of a pharaoh who fears their growing numbers and sees them as a threat. For centuries, the Israelites cry out to God, yearning for deliverance from the heavy yoke of slavery. Then, God chooses Moses, a humble man with a complicated past, to lead his people to freedom. Moses, once a prince of Egypt, is now called by God through the miracle of a burning bush to confront Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. Despite his fears and doubts, Moses accepts the mission, setting into motion a series of events that reveal God's unmatched power over all creation. Through 10 devastating plagues, each aimed at weakening Pharaoh's resolve and undermining the Egyptians' faith in their gods, God systematically dismantles the power structure keeping his people enslaved. Each plague, blood, frogs, gnats, flies, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally, the death of the firstborn, serves as a divine act of judgment, sending a clear message that liberation cannot be denied. The final plague, which brings death to every Egyptian firstborn, leads to the institution of the Passover, a lasting symbol of God's protection and favor over his people. With Pharaoh finally allowing the Israelites to leave, the story intensifies as God leads them through the wilderness by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. But Pharaoh's heart hardens once more, and he pursues them with his army, pushing them toward the seemingly impossible challenge of the Red Sea. Then, in one of the most iconic miracles of all time, God parts the waters, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry land while the waters return to drown their enemies, symbolizing the ultimate victory over oppression and the beginning of a new chapter for the people of Israel. Their journey through the wilderness, however, is filled with trials and moments of doubt, as the Israelites learn what it means to trust in God completely. As they face hunger, thirst, and the daunting unknown, God provides for them with manna from heaven and water from a rock, demonstrating his constant care and teaching them the importance of faith and obedience. Through these events, the Exodus story becomes not just a tale of escape from physical bondage but a journey of spiritual transformation, one that holds profound lessons for all generations. God's deliverance is not always immediate or without challenges, yet his presence is steadfast and his promises unfailing. If you're new here, or if you've enjoyed our journey through this powerful story so far, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel. With each episode, we dive deeper into the Bible, exploring the depth of God's Word and discovering life-changing insights. By subscribing, you won't miss any of our future lessons, which will continue to delve into these ancient stories and uncover their relevance for our lives today. As we wrap up this incredible narrative, keep in mind that the Exodus was only the beginning of the Israelites' journey. After crossing the Red Sea, they faced years in the wilderness and eventually arrived at Mount Sinai, where God gave them the 10 Commandments and set forth a covenant that would define their identity as his chosen people. In our next episode, we'll pick up where this story leaves off, diving into the profound moments at Mount Sinai and understanding what it means to live by God's laws. The bondage in Egypt. The story of Exodus begins in a period of intense suffering for the Israelites. These were the descendants of Jacob, or Israel, who originally came to Egypt as a small family during a time of famine, under the guidance of Joseph, one of Jacob's sons who had risen to prominence in Egypt. However, as generations passed, a new pharaoh came to power, one who knew nothing of Joseph and his contributions. All he saw was a growing population of foreigners, Israelites, whom he feared might one day rise up against him or join Egypt's enemies. To prevent any potential threat, Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites, forcing them into brutal labor to build his cities, erect monuments, and work in the fields. This enslavement was meant not only to break their spirits but also to keep them weak and controllable. Pharaoh hoped that by treating them harshly, he could stamp out any dreams of freedom and ensure his control over the land. Yet, despite Pharaoh's efforts to control them, the Israelites continued to grow in number, and Pharaoh became even more determined to suppress them. He issued a cruel edict, commanding the midwives to kill every newborn Hebrew boy. The midwives, however, feared God and courageously defied Pharaoh's orders, allowing the boys to live. This act of faith by the midwives was one of the first examples of resistance, showing that even in the darkest times, acts of righteousness and courage can spark change. In response, Pharaoh took an even more ruthless step, ordering that every Hebrew boy be cast into the Nile River. This command spread terror among the Israelites, yet it also set the stage for the miraculous story of Moses, a child saved from the very waters meant to end his life. Through this period of suffering, the Israelites cried out to God, yearning for deliverance. Their faith remained, even in their harsh conditions. God, hearing their cries and seeing their pain, began to set his plan in motion. This bond between God and his people, built upon promises made to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would prove unbreakable. Their trials in Egypt highlighted the need for a powerful and faithful leader, one who would not only free them from their physical bondage but also guide them spiritually, preparing them for a new identity and future. This was the beginning of their journey towards liberation, but also towards a deeper relationship with God. In the midst of the Israelites' suffering, God had already begun preparing a leader, someone who would defy Pharaoh and bring his people out of Egypt. This leader was Moses, a Hebrew by birth but raised in the royal courts of Egypt. His story begins with an extraordinary act of faith by his mother, Jochebed. When Moses was born, she saw that he was no ordinary child, and to protect him from Pharaoh's decree, she hid him for 3 months. But hiding a growing baby became impossible, and in a last act of hope, she placed Moses in a basket and set him afloat on the Nile River, entrusting his fate to God. In a remarkable twist of fate, Pharaoh's own daughter discovered the baby while bathing by the river. She took pity on him and decided to raise him as her own son, giving Moses an upbringing that included the best of Egyptian education and privilege. Though Moses was raised as an Egyptian prince, he never forgot his roots. One day, while witnessing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, Moses was moved with anger and intervened, killing the Egyptian. Fearing for his life after this act, he fled Egypt and settled in the land of Midian, where he became a shepherd, marrying and starting a family. Here, Moses lived in relative peace for many years, away from the powerful life he once knew in Egypt. But God had a purpose for him that was far greater than he could have imagined. While tending to his father-in-law's sheep near Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, Moses encountered a strange and miraculous sight, a bush that was on fire but was not consumed. As Moses drew closer, he heard the voice of God calling to him from within the flames. God introduced himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and revealed his plan to deliver the Israelites from slavery. He had seen their suffering and heard their cries for help. Now, he was sending Moses to Pharaoh to demand the release of his people. Moses, however, was filled with doubt and fear. He questioned his own ability to confront Pharaoh and lead the Israelites. "Who am I," he asked, "that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God reassured him, saying, "I will be with you," and provided Moses with signs to prove his power. Yet Moses continued to hesitate, worried about his speaking ability. In response, God appointed his brother Aaron as his spokesperson, ensuring that Moses would not face this mission alone. This encounter at the burning bush was more than just a calling, it was the beginning of a partnership between God and Moses that would redefine both of their lives. God revealed his name to Moses as, "I am who I am," emphasizing his eternal and self-sustaining nature. By using this name, God assured Moses and the Israelites that he was not only present with them but also unchanging and powerful enough to fulfill his promises. Moses finally accepted his role, albeit reluctantly, and returned to Egypt, armed with God's assurances and the resolve to lead his people out of bondage. His journey from shepherd to deliverer had begun, and through him, God's plan for the salvation of Israel would unfold. The 10 Plagues. With Moses and his brother Aaron back in Egypt, they set out to confront Pharaoh with God's command, "Let my people go." Pharaoh, however, was obstinate and refused to release the Israelites. In response, God initiated a series of judgments upon Egypt, known as the 10 Plagues. Each plague served not only as a punishment but also as a statement of God's power over Egypt's gods and Pharaoh's perceived authority. The plagues were designed to weaken Egypt's grip on the Israelites and to reveal the might of the one true God. Each devastating blow struck at the heart of Egyptian life and beliefs, dismantling their sense of control and superiority. The first plague turned the Nile River, Egypt's lifeblood, into blood. This struck at the heart of Egyptian society, as the Nile was central to their survival, their economy, and their worship. The Egyptians revered the river as a source of life, but now it had become a source of death, with fish dying and the water undrinkable. Pharaoh's magicians attempted to mimic this act but failed to reverse it, yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, refusing to free the Israelites. Next, God sent a plague of frogs that swarmed the land, filling homes, ovens, and beds. The frogs were relentless, disrupting everyday life in every corner of Egypt. Pharaoh, disturbed by this invasion, asked Moses to pray to God to remove the frogs, promising to let the people go. But once the plague lifted, Pharaoh broke his word, and his heart remained hardened. Then came the third plague, gnats, small biting insects that covered both people and animals. Pharaoh's magicians couldn't replicate this miracle, admitting to Pharaoh that, "This is the finger of God." Despite their acknowledgement, Pharaoh still refused to relent. The fourth plague brought swarms of flies, filling the land of Egypt but miraculously sparing the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. This distinction made it clear that God was protecting his people even as he struck Egypt. Again, Pharaoh temporarily relented, only to harden his heart once the flies were gone. Then came the fifth plague, a deadly disease that swept through Egypt's livestock, sparing only the animals of the Israelites. Pharaoh investigated and confirmed that none of the Israelite livestock had been affected, yet he continued to resist. In the sixth plague, Moses scattered ashes into the air, which became festering boils on both humans and animals throughout Egypt. Even Pharaoh's magicians suffered, and they could no longer stand before Moses because of the pain. Yet, Pharaoh's heart remained unyielding. The seventh plague brought a storm of hail and fire that destroyed crops, trees, and anything left in the open. Pharaoh admitted his sin and begged for the hail to stop, but once again, when the storm ceased, he refused to let the Israelites go. The eighth plague brought locusts that devoured what little vegetation remained after the hail. Pharaoh's officials urged him to let the Israelites go, warning that Egypt was already ruined, but Pharaoh allowed only the men to leave, which was unacceptable to Moses. With the plague of locusts devastating the land, Pharaoh's refusal persisted. Then came the ninth plague, a thick darkness that covered Egypt for 3 days, a darkness so profound that people couldn't even see each other. However, the Israelites once again were spared, living in light. This plague directly challenged the Egyptian sun god Ra, showing that even their most revered deity was powerless before the God of Israel. Finally, the 10th and most devastating plague was announced, the death of every firstborn in Egypt, from Pharaoh's own son to the lowest servant's child, and even the firstborn of animals. To protect the Israelites, God instituted the Passover. Each Israelite household was to sacrifice a lamb, painting its blood on their doorposts as a sign for the Lord to pass over them. This became a symbol of deliverance that would be remembered and celebrated for generations. At midnight, the Lord struck down the firstborn in every Egyptian household, filling the land with mourning and breaking Pharaoh's resistance at last. The 10 plagues were not just punishments, they were divine signs pointing to God's authority and mercy. Through these events, the Israelites and Egyptians alike saw that God was sovereign over nature, kings, and even life itself. Pharaoh finally relented, allowing the Israelites to leave Egypt. Yet even in their newfound freedom, challenges awaited them, for the journey to the Promised Land was just beginning. This extraordinary display of God's power marked a pivotal moment in Israel's history, setting the stage for their journey through the wilderness and the formation of a covenant at Mount Sinai. The Passover is one of the most significant and symbolic events in the story of the Exodus, embodying the themes of deliverance, faith, and the power of God's promises. This pivotal moment came just before the final plague, the death of every firstborn in Egypt. God commanded the Israelites to take part in a unique ceremony, one that would both protect them from the impending judgment and serve as a lasting testament to his saving power. Each Israelite household was to select an unblemished lamb, symbolizing purity and innocence. They were instructed to slaughter the lamb at twilight and to apply its blood on the doorposts and lintel of their homes. This sign was a mark of obedience and faith, an outward act reflecting an inner trust in God's instructions. That night, the Israelites gathered in their homes, following God's specific directions for the meal. They were to roast the lamb and eat it along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, all while dressed and ready to leave Egypt at a moment's notice. The unleavened bread symbolized the haste with which they would depart, as they would not have time to let bread rise. The bitter herbs reminded them of the bitterness of slavery, a life of suffering that God was about to transform into freedom. God's instructions also emphasized the readiness and alertness of his people, preparing them mentally and spiritually for the journey ahead. As they ate the Passover meal, God's judgment swept through Egypt. At midnight, the Lord passed over the land, and every firstborn in Egypt, human and animal alike, was struck down, from the palace of Pharaoh to the humblest home. However, in every Israelite household marked by the blood of the Lamb, God passed over, sparing the firstborn. This act of mercy, based on their obedience to God's instructions, demonstrated his protective power and faithfulness. The Israelites were not saved by their strength or status, but by their trust in God and their willingness to follow his commands. This final plague broke Pharaoh's spirit. The death of his own son led him to summon Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night, urging them to leave Egypt immediately with all their people and possessions. Pharaoh's advisors and the Egyptian people echoed his sentiment, desperate for relief from the suffering and terror they had endured. The Israelites, who had prepared as God instructed, gathered their belongings, took their unleavened bread, and left in haste. They also received silver, gold, and other goods from the Egyptians, fulfilling God's promise that they would not leave empty-handed. The Passover was not just a one-time event but a covenantal moment that God commanded the Israelites to observe annually. He instructed them to keep this feast for all generations, a lasting memorial of the night he delivered them from slavery. The Passover meal, with its symbolic elements, became a reminder of God's mercy and a time to teach future generations about his mighty works. Each year, as families gathered to celebrate, they would remember the lamb's blood on the doorposts and God's protection over their ancestors. The significance of Passover extends beyond the immediate events of the Exodus. It became a cornerstone of Israelite identity, reinforcing the idea that they were a people set apart by God, saved by his power and bound to him by covenant. For the Israelites, Passover was a reminder of God's deliverance and his promise-keeping nature. It was also a foreshadowing of a greater deliverance that would come in the future. Just as God had saved them from physical slavery, he would one day send a Messiah to deliver humanity from the bondage of sin. The blood of the Passover lamb would be mirrored in the sacrificial love of Christ, whose death and resurrection would bring salvation to all who believe. As the Israelites left Egypt that night, they were not just escaping a life of slavery, they were stepping into a new identity as a chosen people, free to serve and worship God. Passover marked the beginning of a journey that would lead them to the Promised Land, though the path would be challenging and their faith would be tested. This sacred night of deliverance, however, would stand as a testament to God's faithfulness, a divine act that echoed through generations and continues to resonate with believers today. The Israelites' departure from Egypt, known as the Exodus, was not just an escape from physical bondage but a momentous journey toward becoming a nation under God's guidance. After the final plague, Pharaoh urgently commanded Moses and Aaron to take the Israelites out of Egypt without delay. The Egyptian people, now fully aware of the power of Israel's God, were eager to see them leave, fearful of further calamities. Following God's instructions, the Israelites left in haste, carrying their unleavened dough and the precious goods they had received from their Egyptian neighbors. This act of receiving wealth from the Egyptians was a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, that his descendants would come out of captivity with great possessions. The Exodus was a massive movement of people. Over 600,000 men, along with women, children, and livestock, set out from the land of Goshen, forming a vast community journeying together. God did not lead them on the shortest route through Philistine territory, fearing they might face battles that would discourage them and lead them to return to Egypt. Instead, he guided them on a path through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. This detour was part of God's protective plan, designed to strengthen the Israelites' trust in him and prepare them for the challenges ahead. As they traveled, God manifested his presence among them in a remarkable way. By day, he led them with a pillar of cloud, and by night, a pillar of fire illuminated their path, giving them light and assurance in the darkness. These pillars symbolized God's constant guidance and protection, reminding the Israelites that they were not alone in this journey. This divine presence reassured them that God was with them, directing their steps and providing for their needs. Meanwhile, Pharaoh's heart hardened once again. Realizing that he had lost his entire slave labor force, he regretted letting the Israelites go and decided to pursue them. Pharaoh gathered his army, including his chariots and horsemen, determined to bring the Israelites back to Egypt by force. As the Israelites camped by the Red Sea, they saw the approaching Egyptian army and were filled with fear, feeling trapped between the sea and their oppressors. In this moment of panic, they cried out to Moses, questioning why he had led them out of Egypt only to face certain death in the wilderness. Moses, however, reassured them with words of faith. He told them, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still." These words encapsulated the faith that God had called the Israelites to embody, a trust in his power even when the situation seemed impossible. Then, God instructed Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea, and in a miraculous display of divine power, the waters parted, creating a dry path through the sea. The Israelites crossed the Red Sea on dry ground, with walls of water on either side of them. This miraculous crossing marked a decisive act of liberation, a moment when the Israelites experienced firsthand the saving power of their God. Once they had safely crossed, the Egyptian army pursued them into the sea. But as Moses stretched his hand over the sea once more, the waters returned, covering Pharaoh's chariots, horsemen, and soldiers. The entire army was swept away, and not a single Egyptian survived. The threat of Egypt was finally removed, and the Israelites were truly free. On the other side of the Red Sea, the Israelites celebrated their deliverance with a song of praise to God, led by Moses and his sister Miriam. This song, known as the Song of the Sea, is one of the oldest recorded hymns of victory, exalting God as a warrior who triumphs over his enemies and rescues his people. The Israelites sang of God's strength and faithfulness, declaring that, "The Lord is my strength and my song, he has become my salvation." This celebration was a powerful expression of gratitude and reverence, solidifying their identity as a people redeemed by God's mighty hand. The exodus from Egypt was a defining moment for the Israelites, transforming them from a nation of slaves into a community united by faith in the one true God. This act of deliverance set the stage for their journey through the wilderness, where they would learn to rely on God's provision and follow his commands. The crossing of the Red Sea was a testament to God's commitment to his people, showing that he would go to any lengths to secure their freedom and bring them to the land he had promised. But this was just the beginning of their story. Ahead lay a wilderness filled with challenges that would test their faith and obedience. As they ventured into the unknown, God would continue to reveal himself to them, teaching them what it meant to be his people and to live according to his ways. The Exodus marked the start of a covenant relationship that would shape Israel's destiny and their understanding of God for generations to come. The wilderness journey. The Exodus from Egypt was a tremendous victory, yet it marked only the beginning of the Israelites' journey. Freed from slavery, they now entered the wilderness, a vast and desolate land where they would learn to rely entirely on God. This journey was not merely a physical trek toward the promised land but a spiritual transformation, as God taught them what it meant to be his people. The wilderness represented both a place of testing and a divine classroom, where Israel would learn faith, obedience, and the importance of trust in God's provision. At the start of their journey, the Israelites soon encountered their first challenges. Only 3 days after crossing the Red Sea, they found themselves without drinkable water. They arrived at a place called Marah, but the water there was bitter and undrinkable. The people began to grumble against Moses, questioning why he had led them into a land where they would face thirst and possible death. In response, Moses cried out to God, and God instructed him to throw a piece of wood into the water, making it sweet and drinkable. This was the first of many instances where God would provide for his people in seemingly impossible situations, demonstrating his care and reminding them of his presence. Shortly after, the Israelites faced the issue of food. They remembered the plentiful meals they had in Egypt and began to grumble again, expressing doubt about whether God could provide for them in such a barren place. Once more, God responded to their needs with patience and provision. He promised to rain down bread from heaven, which the people called manna. Each morning, they found manna covering the ground like dew, and each family gathered enough for their daily needs. On the 6th day, they were instructed to gather twice as much to observe the Sabbath, a day of rest and worship. Through this daily miracle, God not only sustained his people but also taught them dependence and obedience, showing that he was their ultimate provider. In addition to manna, God provided quail in the evening, giving the Israelites meat as they had desired. Despite their complaints and doubts, God showed his mercy by meeting their physical needs time and again. However, these provisions came with instructions that tested their faith. They were told to gather only what they needed for each day, trusting that God would provide anew each morning. Some disobeyed and attempted to store extra manna, only to find that it spoiled. This was a lesson in trust, teaching the Israelites to rely on God's provision each day rather than hoarding out of fear. The journey continued, and the Israelites faced another shortage of water at a place called Rephidim. Once again, they quarreled with Moses, questioning God's presence among them. Moses, frustrated and desperate, cried out to God, who instructed him to strike a rock with his staff. When he did, water miraculously flowed out, providing for the people and their livestock. This act of provision was another testament to God's faithfulness, even when his people struggled with doubt and grumbling. During their time in the wilderness, the Israelites also encountered external threats. At Rephidim, they faced an attack from the Amalekites, a nomadic tribe that sought to destroy them. Moses instructed Joshua, a young leader who would later succeed him, to assemble a fighting force. As the battle raged, Moses stood on a hilltop, holding the staff of God in his hands. Whenever Moses raised his hands, the Israelites prevailed. When he lowered them, the Amalekites gained ground. To support him, Aaron and Hur held up Moses' hands until sunset, ensuring victory for Israel. This battle emphasized the importance of relying on God's power in all circumstances and revealed the significance of leadership and support within the community. The wilderness journey was filled with moments like these, times of need, testing, and divine provision. Each challenge was an opportunity for the Israelites to grow in their understanding of God's character and His commitment to them. Despite their frequent doubts and complaints, God remained faithful, guiding them step by step. He provided food, water, protection, and guidance, teaching the Israelites that He was with them, even in the harshest of environments. Through these experiences, God was preparing His people for the covenant He would soon establish with them at Mount Sinai. In the wilderness, the Israelites learned to live by God's guidance, to depend on His provision, and to follow His commandments. This journey was a refining process, shaping a community that would be dedicated to Him alone. Although the wilderness was a place of hardship, it was also where Israel's identity as a people chosen by God began to take shape. As the Israelites continued their journey, they drew closer to Mount Sinai, where God would reveal His laws and solidify His covenant with them. The trials they faced in the wilderness were not just obstacles but preparation for the responsibility of being God's people. Each step brought them closer to understanding the depth of their relationship with God, who had freed them, sustained them, and called them to a new life of faith and obedience. The story of the Exodus and the Israelites' journey through the wilderness is more than an ancient account of escape from slavery. It is a profound testimony of faith, deliverance, and the formation of a covenantal relationship between God and His people. Through each trial, whether it was thirst, hunger, external enemies, or the internal struggle to trust, God revealed His character as a provider, protector, and redeemer. These experiences were a training ground, shaping the Israelites into a nation that could understand and uphold the responsibilities of being God's chosen people. Though they often faltered in faith, God remained steadfast, guiding them with patience and continually reinforcing the trust that would anchor their identity. The Exodus story reminds us that God's deliverance is not always immediate or without challenges, yet His presence is unwavering. Each provision of manna, every drink of water, and each victory over an enemy underscored God's commitment to His people and His power to sustain them. The wilderness journey was not merely a physical path but a spiritual pilgrimage, a time for the Israelites to understand their dependency on God and the need to obey His commands. It was a preparation for what was to come, a covenant that would define their relationship with God and establish them as a holy nation. As the Israelites approached Mount Sinai, where God would give them the 10 Commandments and the laws that would guide their lives, they were on the threshold of a new beginning. The journey so far had been one of deliverance and survival, but what lay ahead was a call to deeper devotion and commitment. God would soon invite them into a covenant, setting forth principles and laws that would not only govern their behavior but also reflect His holiness and love. This covenant would be a foundation for the Israelites' identity, binding them to God and setting them apart from other nations. In our next script, we will pick up at this monumental moment at Mount Sinai, where the Israelites will stand before God to receive His commandments. This was a pivotal point in their journey and in biblical history, as God's laws would shape not only their community but also the spiritual framework that would influence generations to come. At Sinai, they would learn what it meant to live as God's people, embodying the values of justice, mercy, and devotion. This covenant was not just a set of rules but a call to a life of holiness and faithfulness. If you've been inspired by this journey through the story of Exodus, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. Together, we'll explore the significance of the 10 Commandments and the transformative impact of the covenant God established with His people at Mount Sinai. This was a moment that echoed through history, and in our next session, we'll see how these laws continue to influence our understanding of justice, community, and the relationship between God and humanity.